My name is Victor DeMonk. I'm the moderator for this, and welcome to a talk entitled Psychedelics, Sociality, and Human Evolution by Michael Winkelmann. It's sponsored by the Society for Anthropological Sciences, Vilnius University, and the recently formed Lithuanian Anthropological Association. So I expect we're all looking forward to an intriguing trip into a world where our ancestors discovered fungi that gave our mind a nudge towards transcendence and sociality. But before I begin, I just want to add that next week we're having a talk at the same time, March 24th, and we'll post the information on this. And it's for anthropologists who will speak on issues related to war, its causes and consequences. And since we're in Lithuania, but in the US too, we're all horrifically captured, I think, by the situation in Ukraine. The four speakers will be Douglas Fry from the University of North Carolina, David Hennick from Utrecht, and Catherine Lutz from Brown University, and Glenn Peterson. And I'll send an announcement to the AAA Community Board, but I think we'll put up a chat where if you want to register for next week's talk, you can. Okay, that's it for that. The rest is all Michael Winkelmann. Michael Winkelmann received his PhD from UC Irvine, where I actually taught for 2 years. But I didn't know him at the time. But I taught at the same time he was there, or no, a little bit later. He has engaged in cross-cultural and interdisciplinary research on shamanism, psychedelics, and the alteration of consciousness in order to identify universal patterns of healing ritual and their underlying biological mechanisms. His cross-cultural research findings on shamanism were presented in his, I think his first book, Shamans, Priests, and Witches in 1992. In a subsequent book, Shamanism, a biopsychosocial paradigm of consciousness and healing, which was in its second edition in 2010, he developed his biogenetic model of shamanism and explains the evolutionary origins of their ancient spiritual and ritual healing capacities. This biological and evolutionary approach to human spirituality is expanded in Supernatural is Natural in 2008, co-authored with John Baker, and The Supernatural After the Neuroturn in 2019, I'm sorry. The role of psychedelics in human evolution and healing has been addressed in many of his publications, most recently in Advances in Psychedelic Medicine, 2019, co-edited with Ben Sessa. Also, he was a recent guest editor for a special issue in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies on psychedelics in history and world religions. In much of his writings, as I suspect in this talk, he documents the widespread use of entheogens and their adaptive effects in our mental health, spurring affirmative and flexible relations with other human beings, and giving us a propensity to see nature beyond the horizons of the mundane. Professor Winkelmann retired from the School of Human Evolution and Social Change, Arizona State University in 2009, and is currently living in the Central Highlands of Brazil, where he is developing a permacultural lifestyle while continuing his academic research. If you are interested in getting in touch with him, I think in his first slide, he will have his website address, and we'll also post his Gmail, which he gave us permission to put in the chat box. So welcome aboard. Then the engineer of the train is Michael Winkelmann. I'm the ticket conductor, and I'm sure we'll have an interesting journey finding out how humans discovered ethnogenes, which in turn aided human evolution and our capacity for transcendence, joy, and cooperation. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll do it in the order that we receive them. And also at the end, you can raise your hands, but the hand raising will come after the messages we receive in the chat. So Mike, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Victor, for inviting me to do this. It's a pleasure to share my ideas. He gave me some words in Lithuanian to say to be polite, but I'm just not going to try. I'm just going to say thank you all for understanding English and making it possible to do this presentation. So this presentation on psychedelics, sociality, and human evolution is an idea that I've been working on for a long time. I'm certainly not the first person to come up with this idea. It has a long, famous and infamous history, including Weston LeBar and, of course, Terence McKenna. But they didn't have the information that we have today. And so what I want to be presenting to you today is some understandings that's really based on what clinical and psychedelic sciences have discovered in the last 10 to 15 years. I made my first effort at explaining the basic ideas that I'm going to present today in my book, Shamanism. But mostly it's been things that have developed since then. And most of the articles that I will be counting on today are there at researchgate.net. But most of what I have to say today really comes from just one article. And this is a co-authored article with Jose Rodriguez Arce on psychedelic sociality and human evolution, in which we bring together lots of different kinds of information to help us develop a better understanding of just how it is that psychedelics must have necessarily intersected with the human past. So my PowerPoint doesn't have references in it, but there's lots of them, about 5 or 6 pages worth in this paper, available both at Frontiers and on ResearchGate. The overall view of this talk today, I'm going to characterize as psychointegration. It's a term I've used for many years as an alternative for hallucinogens and psychedelics. And it reflects an understanding of how it is that psychedelics like psilocybin affect the overall dynamics of the brain. And what I have proposed, and which I will partially touch on here, is the idea that what these substances do is create an enhanced integration of the ancient cognitive processes of the brain, and in particular, liberation of the innate modules and their integration. So I'm going to begin with a very evolutionary perspective. How do we know that our hominin ancestors consume psilocybin? Well, the same way that we know that they consume bananas, okay? Other primates do. Our closest cousins in the great apes do. And we'll look at a variety of ecological and behavioral patterns that lead us to conclude that we must have encountered and adapted to these very powerful substances in the environment millions of years ago. One of the important factors that encourage this adaptation has to do with the relationship between psilocybin and the serotonergic nervous system, the most important neuromodulatory system, which is also stimulated at a number of its different types of receptor sites by psilocybin. But perhaps the most important early adaptation has to do with its enhancement of our adaptation to stress. And we'll look at some very specific serotonergic systems stimulated by psilocybin that give us an adaptive stress response rather than a passive one. The broad framework that we're going to use here for addressing these questions is what's called psychedelic instrumentalization. It's a takeoff from the broader concept of drug instrumentalization, which is the idea that we use drugs because they were helpful, not because that they were addictive or debilitating, but because they helped us adapt. They helped us, deal with stress. They kept us awake when we needed to be awake. They let us sleep. It's a well-established perspective in the evolutionary sciences. But for some curious reason, the people that propose drug instrumentalization in general don't even want to talk about psychedelic instrumentalization and don't even want to let us publish in the main journals. Somehow, psychedelic instrumentalization pushes the envelope too far. But we're going to make a very powerful argument, I think, that psychedelic instrumentalization was key to human evolution in a lot of different ways, but in particular through facilitating the development of the cognitive niche. The cognitive niche is the cultural model that we are able to develop because we have certain kinds of cognitive capabilities. And the cultural niche is considered to be the most important factor in human evolution. It was through creating shared models of how to adapt to the environment, get our food, that we were able to move beyond simple physical adaptations. And I'm going to point out that psilocybin has a number of social, emotional, and cognitive effects that are going to enhance the ability to participate in the cognitive niche. So the neurological perspectives are sort of this balance between what does the clinical data say and what do we know about what these substances do in the brain. It's going to start off with the idea that they enable us to integrate information in a normal but normally rare way, something that's analogous to dreams. Dreams being an important form of cognitive integration that occurs during the sleeping periods. The psychedelics mimic that state, as well as producing a variety of psychosocial effects, making us more open to others, less fearful, more likely to bond with other people, more extroverted, greater understanding of other people's intentions, as well as creating a variety of information dynamics. Now, what happens under psychedelics is disabling of the top-down brain control and an enabling of a bottom-up integrative mode of information transfer. It also creates a broad functional integration, long-distance integration across the brain. Of course, perhaps one of the most significant things that the psychedelics did was to stimulate the origins of a natural religion, shamanism. It's what a lot of what I've written about, but I'm only going to just touch on it briefly today, focusing on some of these other issues. So how do we know that our hominin ancestors consumed psychedelic mushrooms? Well, if we look at the great apes and other primates, they ingest medicinal plants. They even eat mushrooms. They use medicinal plants intentionally to treat problems like intestinal parasites, gastrointestinal problems. That fungi consumption and self-medication is widely documented among primates. So there's no reason to question that our hominid ancestors also did this. When did we start doing it? Probably at least 2.5 million years ago, when our exposure to psychedelic fungi intensified when we were present on the grasslands of Africa. And there in bovine feces, we would have encountered psilocybin mushrooms growing. And this is something that would have been a part of our adaptation, because first we were scavenging carcasses of bovines killed by carnivores, and later we were hunting them. And even after the movement out of Africa, psilocybin mushrooms are found in most ecozones of the world. Probably only the Arctic and Antarctic and subarctic regions don't have some psilocybin-containing mushrooms. So the widespread presence of psilocybin in the past in the environment of evolutionary adaptation assured that hominids would have encountered mushrooms and would have experimented with them. Indeed, one might argue that an adaptation to understanding edible mushrooms, toxic mushrooms, and psychedelic psilocybin mind-altering mushrooms had to be a very early adaptation and may even have some biological components to it. So psilocybin was a common element in the environment of evolutionary adaptation. And we know this today for a number of reasons. One being that there are a number of different genres with psilocybin. They're found almost in all ecozones. And this is not just a recent phenomenon. We know this because there are region-specific psilocybin-containing mushrooms that are still only found in certain regions of the world, implying a great antiquity and, of course, an adaptation to their specific ecozone. Of course, in addition to the psilocybin mushrooms, we have the Amanita species worldwide. Some of their biological mechanisms are distinctly different from psilocybin, acting on the GABAergic neurons, but the net effects on cognitive function, I think, is very much the same, just different mechanisms. Now, this encounter with these mushrooms worldwide happened long in the past, long before modern culture, civilizations. And we see this as attested to in petroglyphs all over the world, in Russia, Bronze Age in Europe, in Spain, where they've actually been able to identify the likely species based upon detailed features. In Africa and Algeria, a sketch here, another. Even in Egypt, it's been proposed that the Egypt crown was in fact modeled after the most potent of the mushrooms, the one right here before the cap opens up. I've recently done research in India, Khajuraho, the famous Kama Sutra temples, where we find on the thresholds of almost every temple in what is one of the most important temple sites in India, mushrooms. You have to step on the head of the mushroom, basically, to get into the sanctuary. Why Wasson missed these, I don't know, but Clearly, India has an entheogenic background. The Mayans had it, the famous mushroom stones. You find even Amanita ceramics from hundreds of years ago in Mesoamerica, Peruvian mushroom stones, mushroom artifacts around Argentina. Virtually all around the world, wherever you look, you're going to find in ancient past representations of mushrooms. This shows that this was important to religions. And indeed, it probably wasn't a significant factor in the evolution of shamanism from a baseline of hominid ritual practices. Can't talk about that much here today, but I've explored in these two articles, Psychedelics, the Shamanism and Psychedelics, where I've looked at an evolutionary paradigm for understanding why it is that we should consider psilocybin to have been a central factor in motivating this development. And basically because the effects of psilocybin and the nature of shamanic practice is very similar. Visionary experiences, soul flight, internal powers that you experience in the body, divination, animal relations, death and rebirth experiences, even altruistic behavior. We now know from double-blind clinical studies that psilocybin induces altruism, and it has a long-term effect. And we know from double-blind clinical studies that mystical and spiritual experiences can be provoked by psilocybin in controlled conditions. About 80% of the people score at their highest level in their entire life in terms of mystical experiences on their first psilocybin experience. So my other article here explores how this evolutionary interaction emerged between psychedelics and shamanism, with shamanism basically developing a ritual paradigm that enhanced the ability to incorporate these effects. Presence of entheogens in world religions, in India, in Judaism, in ancient Egypt, and ancient traditions of Europe, even in Christianity. There's a special issue of Journal of Psychedelic Studies, 2019, on psychedelics and history and world religion. They are everywhere in our past. The question is, how do we incorporate that understanding into how we now review our past? I'm going to suggest that the implications of this transcultural phenomenon, the worldwide presence of psilocybin mushrooms, indicates we need to have a biological perspective. We need to view the entheogenic experience as a biological universal. Human cultures everywhere encountered these substances, used them, had mystical and spiritual experiences, and figured out how to incorporate these into their culture, into their religions, into their spiritual practice and shamanic activities. And this idea of psychointegration that I want to present here is basically the notion that the effects of psilocybin stimulated both serotonergic and dopaminergic systems. And the net effect was to invoke a bottom-up dynamic in the brain that integrated our unconscious brain mechanisms into our consciousness. So we have evidence of the effects of drugs on human evolution, beginning with special enzymes that we have in metabolic processes that take what are normally considered to be plant toxins designed to deter consumption and turn them into neurotransmitters. That in essence, the ability to consume and metabolize these substances gave us an enhanced performance on a variety of goal-directed behaviors that enabled us to have more energy, more endurance, to resist pain, or to relax or be more sociable when necessary. So this idea that there was positive effects on adaptation through the utilization of psychedelics has led to this, or utilization of drugs in general, has led to this drug instrumentalization theory that says that drug use was functional. It was not an addictive breakdown in our defensive mechanisms. Rather, it was doing something that was adaptive and enabled us to more effectively function in the physical and the social environments in which we found ourselves. So the psychedelic instrumentalization is our novel approach here. And the idea is that psychedelics went far beyond the stimulants and the pain numbers to enhance performance on a variety of fitness-relevant behaviors. That in fact, they enhanced our ability to participate in a cognitive niche, to imagine cognitive niches, to create new cognitive niches. And in contrast to some claims about psychedelics being dangerous, toxic substances that had to be avoided. What we know, in fact, is that psilocybin is far less toxic than most of the pharmaceuticals being prescribed by doctors. Its therapeutic index is in the 600s. Its toxicity is virtually negligible. You'd have to eat like 16 kilos of most psilocybin mushrooms to get anywhere near a toxic dose. Rather than being a toxin, it had to be considered something that increased our fitness, because ingesting these plants enabled us to utilize their compounds, which resemble our endogenous neurotransmitters. And so that there are a number of different adaptive results of using these substances that enhanced our capacities to do a variety of social and cognitive behaviors. How do they act on the brain? Well, they act first on the serotonin pathways. Psilocybin is an agonist. It stimulates the serotonin receptors. Serotonin is key to higher cognitive processes, and significantly, it regulates the triune brain. Basically, it's a repressive mechanism. It keeps the emotional and behavioral aspects of the brain repressed so that the cognitive ones can have full reign. But psilocybin and other 5-HT2 psychedelics also have secondary effects. Eventually, they block out the serotonin sites because they're not as susceptible to reuptake. And so the serotonin system eventually gets blocked out. Its repressive mechanisms are freed, and it liberates the dopaminergic brain, which is then projecting all of its activity into the frontal cortex. And a system that evolved in mammals for bonding and attachment underwent a variety of evolutionary developments in the hominid line, including an enhanced ability to integrate groups, for instance, through singing and dancing and chanting, which stimulate the endorphins. And in essence, it liberated the lower aspects of the brain, this triune brain, the reptilian brain, the paleomammalian brain, and it enabled these ancient psychological, emotional, and cognitive processes to be brought up into consciousness. It's a bottom-up dynamic, which replaces the normal top-down control by the brain. It also enhances what Fred Previck has called extrapersonal cognition. It enhances our ability to think about things away from our physical body, things distant in space and time. Perhaps the most significant first adaptation provided by the use of psilocybin had to do with stress adaptation. Humans have two serotonin-mediated responses to stress and adversity. One that's mediated by the 5-HT1A receptor, and it's the default signaling system that basically enables a passive coping strategy. You endure, you tolerate stress, you just put up with what's bothering you. But we also have a 5-HT2A receptor signaling system that's an active coping strategy. It enables us to respond to stress by changing stressful circumstances or our relationship to them. And psilocybin and other serotonergic psychedelics preferentially engage the 5-HT2A receptor signaling system. And by stimulating this system, which evolved to mediate rapid and deep learning when faced with environmental crises and other stressful conditions, it increased our ability to adapt through changing how it is that we related to the problems that we encountered. So what we know from laboratory studies is that psilocybin stimulates a variety of responses of the 5-HT2A receptor signaling system. It elevates cortical neuroplasticity and enabling us to develop new kinds of connections. It enhances our associative learning. It reduces stress and anxiety. It enhances patience, and it increases neuroplasticity, which enables us to rewire our brains to adapt in new ways, and it enhances both creativity and sociality. So what I think was the next major effect in terms of psychedelic instrumentalization was its enhancement of a unique hominin capacity. the socio-cognitive niche or cultural niche, which is to say the socially shared mental constructions that enable us to pass on information from person to person, generation to generation. In the case of human beings, this socio-cognitive niche or cultural niche is considered to be the most important factor in hominin evolution, basically being able to share information from generation to generation. And what was required for this kind of development was the ability to share information, to share models. And what we see as the uniquely human capacities for cognition, sociality, communication, and learning are all enhanced by psilocybin. So the psychedelic instrumentalization hypothesis is that by taking psilocybin, we enhanced our capacities for complex social interaction, to engage with others without fear, to feel more connected to others, and to create larger social groups that could tolerate each other. So the adaptive benefits should be understood in a Baldwinian evolutionary model in the sense that psilocybin stimulated certain kinds of capacities. And those kinds of capacities then were instrumentalized in cultural niche construction. And consequently, those of our ancestors who had the best pre-existing neural and genetic structures for utilizing these substances were the most successful in entering into the cognitive niche, sharing cultural models, and learning from others in those cultural models. And so by that kind of environmental influence, the hominin ancestors were selected for those who could most effectively utilize the psilocybin effects. For managing psychological distress, for treating health problems, for enhancing social interaction, for creating better interpersonal relations, for enhancing our cognitive processes, for engaging in collective decision-making, for being able to see things in a new and different way, and of course, the facilitation of collective ritual and religious activities that must also be considered one of the most significant effects that psilocybin had in creating a new way of relating to the world, using rituals to heal, integrate communities, and to address social problems. So I would like to present the overall dynamic of psychointegration as being one in which the normal dynamic of top-down control is replaced. One of the things that psilocybin does in the brain is disable the prefrontal cortex, which links the frontal cortex with the lower brain, and disables the default mode network, which keeps our habitual, emotional, personal, social reference, personal history dynamics together. And now what we normally have as our personal history and our personal reference and our sense of self and social relations doesn't fit together. In fact, what often happens in these conditions is the ego loss experience. We no longer have this sense of being our normal self. And what we get instead is this amplification of activity from the lower parts of the brain. The reptilian brain and the limbic areas of the brain are now able to send all their information up. So the basal brain areas are engaged in a serotonin-mediated theta wave synchronization of not only the lower brains, but it eventually projects up the neuraxis and synchronizes the frontal cortex. So we're getting a basal, limbic, frontal synchronization, and even a right hemisphere, left hemisphere synchronization. In essence, an integration of the whole brain rather than just a top-down dynamic. And this synchronization of the frontal cortex with this lower brain dynamic means that we're getting the integration of our behavioral and emotional and unconscious dynamics, as well as what can be called paleomentation and emotiomentation. All of this is getting pushed up into the frontal cortex, the big drive. And there, all this information is getting integrated into what is an intrinsic and holistic state of psychological integration of unconscious and conscious dynamics. One of the significant ways in which this is manifested is through the effects of the psilocybin in terms of creating a visual kind of experience. What I would suggest is that hallucinations were the first symbols. It's like, what is that? What does that mean? We're getting information provided for us in a way that reflects the overall increased responsiveness of the brain to all kinds of stimuli. If you have your eyes open, you get the sensory stimuli and multisensory processing exemplified in synesthesia. But when you close your eyes, then now what you're getting is an enhanced input of information from within the brain. And psychedelics expand the activity in the visual cortex. It not only enhances visual cortex activity, but it enhances the connection, the functional connectivity of the visual cortex with the other association areas of the brain. But I think what we have to understand is that this primary process thinking of psychedelics is really a form of thought, and it's a form of thought that existed for millions of years before we had language. It's a form of thought that's found in our ape cousins, and that this really is a form of symbolic representation that is a natural part of the brain that is part of everyday life, and it's how we function in everyday life. But this presentational symbolism gets particularly stimulated under certain conditions. For instance, it's the representational system that underlies dreams. Notably, dreams are largely visual and not verbal. They reflect this ability of the brain to represent for itself important information that then is integrated. That's the function of it in dreaming, is the integration of information through the visual modality. And so this mode of visual mentation, which existed long before language, was what enhanced the capacity for the cognitive niche capabilities that permitted cultural niche constructions. And not only does any cultural niche constructions, creative and novel ones. Was psilocybin part of the expansion of the visual cortex in human evolution? Come up with a better reason why we needed to have better visual processing than the great apes. They have very good visual processing. We do it even better, hardwired in our brain. It was an intrinsic cognitive process that was part of the mechanisms used in dreaming and understanding everyday life that then were integrated and even enhanced through the psychedelic stimulation. Indeed, we ought to consider psychedelics as a perfect tool for understanding the system that emerges in fantasy and daydreaming and nighttime dreaming and mystical visions, a system that existed long before language and provided an image-based cognitive modality that enabled us to think, manipulate images, a metacognitive system for enhancing our ability to handle information. We know that from clinical research that psilocybin enhances a variety of different kinds of social behaviors. It makes us more sociable, reducing startle responses, reducing recognition of sad faces, reducing fearful reactions, and it reduces the sense that we're being socially excluded. On the other hand, it enhances emotional self-control and tolerance and stimulates pro-social attitudes and social connectedness. The research done by Griffiths and others at Johns Hopkins shows that single dose of psilocybin has a pro-social altruistic effect that persists for more than a year and confirmed by third-party observers. So we became more pro-social under the effects of psilocybin. We see this in studies that look at psychological measurements of extroversion and openness, which are enhanced, and the reduction of neuroticism. So the experiences that psychedelics induced made us more altruistic beings, very powerful. It also enhanced our intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligence, the ability to perceive what others are thinking. The notion of telepathy is widespread in psychedelic experiences, whether or not it's truly telepathy or just we think we understand people better, the experience is there. And it enables us to better understand what other people are thinking about us, to introject other people's perspectives. So our intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligences are being enhanced by these substances, and our ability to relate to others socially are also being enhanced. It enhances euphoria, laughter, grinning, giddiness, playfulness, exuberance. It enhances cohesion of groups. It strengthens social bonds among people, and it gives people an increased sense of connectivity with others, all of which would have supported participation in the cognitive and cultural niche. It also enhanced various forms of cognition, this cycle integration. And the major researchers in psychedelics have part of this picture right, but I think they only got the first part. They talk about the lack of structure, the lack of coherence, the loss of priors, the loss of habitual perceptual and conceptual categorization. But what they miss is that it's not just an anarchic brain, as some have argued, it's an archaic brain. It's a brain that functions with its ancient cognitive capabilities rather than with the modern language-based ego-centered one. Clinical findings also show that there's a variety of improvements in cognitive representations, novel mental representations, enhanced mental imagery, greater cognitive flexibility, including the creation of unconventional associations and not normal conceptual linkages. A widely recognized effect of the psychedelics is their meaning-enhancing effects. It gives us a sense of things being more real than real, more meaningful than normal, more important than normal perceptions. And there's evidence that it enhances insightfulness and self-awareness. Also, clinical research showing heightened creativity, more curiosity, greater imagination, insight, perspective change, and an improved ability for creative problem solving, all of which is directly related to creating cultural niches. We also have the effects of psilocybin in creating enhanced brain connectivity. I guess you know which one is the psilocybin model. What happens under psilocybin is that not only do we lose the priors, the top-down determination, we lose this prefrontal cortex's determination of what's most important and shift to lower level integration of information with the frontal cortex, the enhanced integration of the visual cortex with all the association areas, and an augmented communication across the whole brain. We have a greater connectivity, a greater total functional connectivity in the brain than is normal, and a reduction of what are normally separate and non-connected networks. So we have a state of global brain coordination and synchronization with a greater variety of connectivity states. So that is why I say it's not an archaic brain. I mean, it's not an anarchic brain, it's an archaic brain. The parts of the brain that normally don't connect together are all being brought together in connection. And this is another reason why the concept of psychointegration, I think, is so appropriate here. Also, a variety of ways in which our learning abilities are enhanced, the relaxation of prior assumptions and beliefs, suspension of habitual networks created by the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network, allow us to have different perceptions, new ways of thinking. And this enhanced capacity is part of the physiological effects in terms of enhancing neuroplasticity in the brain, neurogenesis, the creation of new neural networks, enhanced learning, extinction learning, which may have been one of the important effects of the psychedelics. You break your old cultural niche model to learn a new one when the old model isn't working anymore. Why? Because you have enhanced cognitive flexibility, enhanced sensitivity to the environment, and overall what the psychedelics that act upon serotonin do is promote structural and functional plasticity in the brain, an ability to create new adaptations because the brain itself is creating new connections. It may in part be due to the impediment of reuptake that psychedelics have in the serotonin system, forcing the brain to find new pathways to transmit the information. I think an overall dynamic of psilocybin and the 5-HT2 psychedelics has to be understood in terms of the disinhibition of the innate modules. What research by people such as Franz Wollenweider and Kathleen Preller has shown is that a major dynamic of the brain on psychedelics is this cortical, striatal, thalamic cortical loops. These loops that go from the bottom of the brain up to the frontal cortex and back down, these are being liberated. And what's being freed is all these lower brain systems. When we look at the effects of psilocybin experientially, phenomenologically, to me, they all map onto what Gardner argued were innate intelligences or innate cognitive operators. Innate capacities acquired in the course of evolution because they were adaptive, such as animacy detection, as well as the ability to infer the thoughts of others, the so-called mind reading, as well as the ability to internalize the social models of others as our own models, the internalization that occurs in socialization. We also have an enhanced ability for understanding animals and animal behavior and innate capacity. We're able to engage in a variety of mimetic behaviors that are also innate operators, song and dance and chanting and imitation. And I think the most important one, although Gardner didn't focus on this, is this visual spatial intelligence, the ability to see things and put pieces together in a visual format. So these effects of psychedelics on the innate modules were including things such as producing this idea of a living universe. Nature has self properties, human cognitive properties, creating spirits. There are other selves out there that we don't see, but they have thoughts and expectations for us. The incorporation of animals as self or as social other, as in animal powers or in totemism. The out-of-body experiences being a special capability to disarticulate some of the normally integrated innate modules, and of course the whole realm of supernatural thought. When Gardner revised his innate thought processes in the year 2000, he added two others. One was a metaphysical intelligence and the other was a spiritual intelligence. He recognized these were innate human capacities. So what are the overall dynamics here? Well, sensory enhancement and connectedness, enhanced access to normally unconscious information. In essence, getting better access to pre-verbal cognitive functions, a psycho-integration of behavioral, emotional, and cognitive information, a cognitive expansion where synesthesia was probably the first form of symbolic thought long before we ever were able to speak in any symbolic kind of way, and an overall enhanced connectivity of the whole brain with the novel integration of brain networks. So the adaptive effects would include amplification of sensory acuity, so it could have made us better hunters and gatherers, and a better sense of connection with the environment that brought in this visual representation system and enhanced our pro-social tendencies to share those visual representations. It gave us improved cognition, better learning, ability to modify learned behaviors that were interrupted by the psychedelics. It also stimulated intrinsic healing processes. Now we have a wide variety of contemporary clinical literature that shows psilocybin has a variety of important healing effects. And of course, it stimulated the development of shamanism, cosmology, healing, dramatic enactments, and various forms of symbolism. So from an evolutionary perspective, what we have in the context of psychedelics is a recognition that these plants have a long-term evolutionary relationship with humans. We evolved enzymatic systems to utilize these things that are considered plant toxins. They produce spiritual states of consciousness that linked us to others and linked us to understandings that were part of our unconsciousness. They integrated important aspects of our brain and amplified our capacities for consciousness by the integration of what were normally unconscious processes, enhanced our capacity for introspection, and so created the foundation for shamanism and ritual cure in ways that still have important implications for humans today. So the facts are there in psychedelic sociality and human evolution. I think that we provided what I would consider to be a very convincing argument about why it is that psychedelics were part of human evolution. Someone might ask, can you prove that? You know, can you prove the stone ape theory? Science doesn't prove things. Science falsifies things. And I have a very simple falsification. My hypothesis is the major differences between the human brain and the chimpanzee brain have to do with the areas of the brain stimulated by psilocybin. this would be a way of establishing that through a Baldwinian effect, psilocybin exercise and environmental influence, selecting for those aspects of human genetics and cognitive and social and emotional capability that made us more capable of participating in the cultural niche. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that stimulating discussion. We have lots of questions for you, so you might be here half the night or half of our night, your afternoon. So I think, Phil, you were first.
Yes, wherever you are, good morning or good evening.
Good afternoon.
Michael, yeah, I'm over here in California, so Michael, if you're in Arizona, we're neighbors. When I taught do you hear me okay?
I'm
yes.
good.
Okay. When I've taught a section on magic and religion, I used the Napoleon Chagnon documentary on the Yanomami. And in that documentary, the use of hallucinogenic snuff is restricted to males. And even among the males, those who aren't able to do well with those effects, they're eliminated for subsequent use of it. So the question that I have is that throughout human history, the question arises whether psychedelics have been restricted either by gender, by class, by specific groups, like to religious groups or priests, and therefore the effects might not be generalized among the entire human population of that particular culture. So I was wondering if you could speak to that problem or the question of distributive effects of psychedelics within different cultural groups.
Well, I mean, Ed Hagen argues that generally we don't find women using psychedelics because they're toxic substances. And some of them certainly are. Psilocybin's not. Generally, you know, it seems that, for instance, in shamanic practice, looking at the foraging societies, women were restricted during childbearing years. So there may be a clear recognition that engaging in profound altered states of consciousness is not good for the fetus. Of course, one can find, you know, sexist reasons and other, you know, oppressive reasons for excluding women in other contexts. But in terms of the influence on the population, if we push it way back into the environment of evolutionary adaptation, those who were able to use these substances had more reproductive activities. They do keep you up all night, and this gives you more opportunities for reproduction. And so we out reproduce those that couldn't handle drugs, you know. We might say, you know, they were able to use these substances and be more successful in all aspects of life. But clearly today, not everybody finds the psilocybin psychedelic effects conducive. But for the most part, when you screen out people that have pre-existing psychiatric problems, there's a very low incidence of adverse events within contemporary clinical research. So ultimately, that kind of argues that just about everybody probably can constructively use these substances. And here's the caveat: in the right set and setting, and perhaps the right phase of reproduction. Don't take them while you're pregnant as a woman. But countering that, the ayahuasca churches permit women to take ayahuasca. They give them small doses.
There's a second aspect of the Yanomami example, if I can go to that. When it's integration with the shamanism and their quote unquote sorcery, it could be for healing, but it also could be for attacking people in the neighboring tribes. So when you talk about sociality, I would say there's the good, the bad, and the ugly about sociality that are enhanced by this process.
For certain, the Yanomami weren't the only groups. Hivado also used the ayahuasca overnight, and you know, and they're up at 3 or 4 in the morning, all charged up, and they go out to attack another village. The Kung Bushmen, Joseon, they use their own psychedelics overnight, and they go hunting the next day. They're up early before the animals. They're all charged. They're full of all these neurotransmitters. But you're very right about, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We have a special issue of psychedelic sociality, frontiers in psychology. One of the articles there talks about right-wing use of psychedelics. So Psychedelics can also create in-group solidarity and coherence of vision, independent of whether it's, peace-loving hippies or hippie-hating, Nazis.
Can we move Carol? I think Carol Amber had a question.
Hi. Hi, thanks so much, Michael. Actually, what you just said relates to my question because I, as you know, I work on war and other kinds of violence. And so I have read about groups such as Maasai. Warriors are given, I don't know what they're given before they engage in battle, but I know that they are given something. I wonder if you know anything about, and that relates to what you were just talking about. So my question really was whether, I don't know what drugs they take, but whether psychobilin has releasing effects of other inhibitions, including not pro-social, but more aggressive activities as well. And I think you've already answered the question.
Well, psilocybin, I don't know. I mean, I don't know of any groups that use psilocybin to engage in warfare, but I don't know about the Maasai either or what they're taking. But clearly, the idea that you bond with your group in a very powerful way and get this sense of invincibleness, which often comes with the psychedelics. I think probably psilocybin could be used in the same way, although I'd like to believe that it was, more of a peace sociality inducing effect. But keep in mind, uniting a group of warriors to go out and kill your enemy is a sociality inducing effect. Everybody has got everybody else's back and they're, going together to do this.
Right. Yes. Well, that's the thing. So the question of sociality is bonding with whom and for what purpose as well.
Well, in-group versus out-group may be a very important dynamic, but keep in mind, the psilocybin reduces fearfulness, it reduces neuroticism, it reduces perceptions of fearful faces. It has a lot of different effects that are found in controlled studies that suggest their intrinsic properties. So one of the things that I'll just comment here, people say, well, if you take psilocybin and you're laying out in the grass, you're going to get eaten by the tigers and lions. No. They need the fear response. They need the animal to run away and fight their own, innate programs. I suspect that, a shaman laying out in the grass on psilocybin has animals walking up and going, what is wrong with this thing? But they don't have the trigger to attack it.
Thanks.
Two quick questions from Phil. And one maybe isn't so important, but he asks in the article, he wants to know some references to publish on non-human primate consuming psilocybin.
No, that's not my question. You answered that one, Victor.
Okay.
Let me jump to the next one. Hello, Michael. I hope you remember me from many years ago. So the question I posed, which had some support from someone else on the panel, is psilocybin is specific. Is it fair? Is it legitimate to jump to all psychedelics? There's a tremendous range of psychedelic substances. Can we generalize about them all the way you have?
Well, I've been very specific. 5-HT2A receptor psychedelics. So, okay, so taking that group, yes, there's cross tolerance and the similarity effects. Certainly there's some differences between LSD and psilocybin, but a lot of the differences that, we see, for instance, between, psilocybin and DMT can be dosage, potency, mode of administration. So for instance, there's a big question in the psychedelic community, is it fair to inject DMT and act as if this really tells us something about what psychedelics are about, because this is not how they're typically used.
Thank you.
But the 5-HT2A, I think, is a tight, group of substances, but also they're promiscuous substances. They're not just affecting serotonin, they're affecting a range of serotonin receptors and many other kinds of receptors as well.
Thanks.
Thanks. We have a question from, where is it? From Cyber Smilga. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing it completely right. Can teenagers start to use psilocybin? Seems like a serious question, so
So I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
This is the question. Can teenagers start to use psilocybin?
Well, you know,
it's a verbatim statement.
Okay. 12 years old, 13 years old, I don't know. Psychedelics were widely used as tools for socialization, initiation in cultures around the world. So I think that the response probably goes back to set and setting. You know, what is the set and setting? And this is the most important determinant of the influences of these substances. So, you know, I knew someone in college who started using LSD at 10, 11 years of age. And when I met him again at 40, he was still like a little kid. Maybe he started too early. But I think that, you know, I would think that eventually we might find that this is a good rite of passage tool. But, you know, how is it going to be used? That's the big question. I think the biggest effects are set and setting beyond pharmacology.
Okay, there's a very good answer. There's a bunch of other questions, but I think, let us know when you're getting tired, but I'm thinking at about 15 minutes, 17 minutes from now, we'll call it a night.
Okay.
But that's still 17 minutes, so there's a bunch of questions we can put in here.
Sure.
Here's one from Matis. How do you personally think, will psilocybin replace popular medicine, and in parentheses, antidepressants that are used to treat depression?
Well, I mean, it's not going to replace all medicines, although it may be close to a panacea, particularly when we take into consideration the fact that it's modulating the most important neuromodulatory system of the body, serotonin. So I have an article, actually, I just recently put it up on ResearchGate, the principal hallucinogenic plants of the Americas. It's like there are dozens and dozens of uses that people had for various kinds of psychedelics, far beyond anything that medicine has imagined now. If we take into consideration neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, yeah, there's a lot of things that it could do. Is it going to replace all of our contemporary medicines? No, no. Will it replace the principal psychiatric medicines? Let's hope so. I mean, you know, keeping in mind that most of the psychiatric medicines being used today, they were approved because they reduced symptoms, not because they cured people. They made people become suicidal and homicidal sometimes. So we know now that psilocybin can be very effective for treating a wide range of emotional disorders. We clearly need more studies. We need to expand the range of conditions for which it had been used. But, you know, yes, we should be able to replace a lot of psychiatric medications with psilocybin, except the pharmaceutical industry is not going to let us. Why? Because they can't patent psilocybin. So they're going to have to make some, you know, psilocybin similar substance and use that instead. But, you know, there's a lot of reason to think that ultimately a lot of this will be decriminalized to the point that therapists can prescribe people using these substances, and that we're going to see that it can resolve a lot of problems. But once again, it presents a big set and setting problem. I mean, you know, you give someone a good dose of psilocybin, someone needs to be looking out for them for 6 to 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours. And so this is the real impediment to effective use in one-on-one psychedelic therapy treatment. We're going to need to move to a group therapy model, a retreat model that's going to enable these kinds of substances to be used more widely, I think.
Okay, we have a number of other questions here. Again, we're just going to go to 1915 here. Let me see, where is it? Here it is. Could you briefly speak to the other species that consume psychedelics and how this connects? The other social species that take them, like dolphins, are particularly striking examples, I think. Thank you for the mind food. This is from Camille LeBlanc.
Great. Yeah, let me just first say, Giorgio Samorini, an Italian guy, has written a book about psychedelic use in animals. The cases seem to be relatively limited, though. There's certainly much broader drug use than psychedelic use per se. There's some anecdotal reports that cougars, you know, the panthers, will eat the Banisteriopsis vine. although many people consider it to be a non-hallucinogenic substance that just is a MAO inhibitor. I would think that, the use of the psilocybin by our other animals may be much more widespread than we realize. And here's my anecdotal story. I used to go look for psilocybin mushrooms late in the morning. And there just wasn't very much left there. You see a few eaten up by animals or birds or something. Started going at 6 in the morning. I found a whole lot more. So maybe you got to be the early bird, but if you're not, the birds and other animals will get them. How they use them, I don't know. But I have generally contended that the psychedelic use is not that widespread in animals. There's anecdotal reports from people who do laboratory studies that say, monkeys and chimpanzees will self-administer psychedelics only once. And once they figure out which lever administers the psychedelics, they won't do that again. So people say, well, I know people that are like that too. Okay. But it may be that what is really important here is already having the brain capacity to make use of the psychedelics. If the brain effects just disorient you, like spiders can't make a good spider web anymore, it's not useful. But if you already have an enhanced visual capacity, a capacity for visual representation, capacity for cultural construction, then the psychedelics can have a different kind of effect. So I haven't looked at the research on dolphins, although I recently saw something about that in the popular press. But my suspicion is that this is going to be largely a practice of more complex brained animals.
Okay, thank you. We have a long one here that starts, wait a minute. Phil, are you there? Phil wanted to jump in, but he's not here. Okay.
I must say, I'm getting little bits of chats coming up here, but I only see like 5 words and I never see a full question. So I can't respond to whatever's being shown in a chat.
So I'm getting the whole message here. So Hitler used amphetamine in military food rations. What do you think would happen if someone would use drugs like psilocybin on serial killers, psychopaths, or soldiers? Is the effect universally good, enhancing intelligence, introspection, and all that for everyone, or is there a way to use this power in some other more malicious ways?
I think this question is already answered. So you can
really?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just make a little comment to say, yeah, the Hivaro shows us that they can be used for, psychedelics can be used for very malicious ways. But I think that once again, it's the set and setting that really determines what the effect is going to be.
Okay, is psilocybin metabolized? This is from Luke Matthews. Is psilocybin metabolized in any particular way that we could compare humans to apes? Human liver ethanol metabolism is way upregulated compared to chimpanzees. Could we look for any analogous evidence like that for past psilocybin use? Did you follow that?
Yeah, not my area of expertise. I look forward to your paper on the topic.
Okay. Katie Carrega, how could this research be transnational and applied to impact policy? I really identified your statement about animals as self or social others. Seems like it has implications for decolonization. I have some research questions in mind for Chiapas. So how could this research be transnational? And
sorry, no, you're misreading the word. It's translational.
Oh, translational. I'm so sorry.
Meaning that it's applicable across a wide variety of conditions? Or?
So I'm like looking up the word because it's one of those things that I use, but I'm like, oh no, I have to explain it. But when I think of translational, it's like, how do we apply this research to practice, right? So like I'm coming, you know me, right? I'm coming from public health. And so, public health, how do we apply this to public health policy, or especially when we're thinking about decolonization, right? Destigmatizing, decriminalization, stuff like that.
Well, I mean, obviously decriminalization, has to be the first step forward here. All the therapeutic models that are being developed by these multi-million-dollar companies, are envisioning $5,000, weekend sessions. I mean, that's not accessible to people. We need to, make it possible for traditional healers to re-implement their practices. And I've heard recently that there really are a lot of indigenous and theogenic mushroom traditions still present in Mexico today. Maria Sabina was not the only one. She was just the one we ended up hearing about. But I think that, the idea of harm reduction should be part of the approach here. And I think the idea of cultural revitalization ought to be considered one of the important applications that can only really happen once we have decriminalization. But one of the interesting things about the use of these substances in shamanism is that many cultures explicitly state, we take these substances, we go out into the wilderness, and on the second or third day, the ancestors come to teach us. We learn about our traditions from contact with our ancestors in the conditions induced by these substances. It's a difficult, thing to accept if you're a narrow scientist, but this is what cultures around the world report and experience, that they can recover their traditions through the use of these substances. And notably, one of the ways that this often is experienced is that the songs come back. The songs show up. And I had a weird experience like this once where I'd been in a retreat in Peru, and I went to Machu Picchu with a bunch of little mushroom chocolates, decided to do them. And I discovered a cave at the bottom of the structure on the backside of Machu Picchu. And I went into it. And 5 minutes later, I started chanting and chanting and chanting things I had never said or heard before. All these songs were just coming through me. I was gone so long, my wife thought I'd gone off and died somewhere. But, I think that the possibility of cultural revitalization through these substances ought to be a core, answer to your question.
Nice answer. Any other questions? I don't see any questions here. Eva, did you have a question there? Because I have one or two questions I can ask you too.
Hi, hello. If there's any chance, I would love to ask a question.
Sure.
Hi, hello.
Hello.
Michael Winkelmann, thank you very much for the speech and talk. So my question is, and was just touched earlier on. So, sorry. So anyway, I would like to know, how do we make psilocybin psychedelic use treatments more available for a wider circle? And you said that the pharmacy big companies, they won't allow it, they will criminalize it, but there's got to be a way. We need to make larger steps towards that.
Well,
so do you have any? Yes, sorry. Do you have any thoughts on how could it happen? Because for example, I've spoken with a startup in the States in the psychedelics psilocybin field, and they just left it after 2-3 years because it's way too expensive. It's the clinical researches, you have to teach the whole staff, so it's just too expensive. Is there any other thoughts or ideas how we could do it?
Well,
Thank you.
I think the first thing is decriminalization. Let's open the field up to people being able to use it on their own. Take it to your therapist. But I think the next step is going to be how can this be used communally? If we look at the models from the past, shamans used it alone or under supervision for development, but the therapeutic use was a communal use. So we need to have groups that can do this. One of the crazy ideas I had some years ago, and I hope that it will eventually come true, we need churches like the Unitarian Universalists to say, we're going to adopt psilocybin as a sacrament. And we're going to start having weekend retreats in which our members can come and use psilocybin, and it's protected under the provisions of the law in the US because it's a sacrament used by an established church. So that could be another mechanism. Ultimately, it has to do with regulation. Right now, psilocybin is considered to be more of a dangerous drug than heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. This is not a scientifically based attitude. It's a political decision. So we need to change the politics. So to me, that plus re-engaging the communal dynamic of use in indigenous cultures around the world, can open up a lot of different avenues for making these available. Local indigenous communities using them for religious purposes ought to be protected under their own country's laws and international conventions. And if they can establish safe formats, contexts for using these things, then they ought to be open to what's in some contexts called medical tourism. People leave the US and go to Mexico to get their dental work done more cheaply. Well, maybe you can leave and go to Kitts or some other Jamaica or some other place and do your psilocybin retreat or ibogaine retreat or whatever it is where local laws permit. So I think we have to move forward on all of these fronts, but decriminalization, incorporating into existing religious practices, both nationally and communally, changing the classification done by government agencies, and opening it up for more and more people to use these in a way that can be seen as constructive and collective.
Thank you.
Very good. Other questions that I missed? If there are, please speak up. Krina?
I had a different question that was missed. It's in the chat, but it was missed.
Go for it.
Oh, you want me to? Okay. Sure. So I was wondering if Dr. Winkelman could speak a little bit more about his research in India and kind of between, the ancient, petroglyphs and everything. And, there's been a lot of history between that. So I'm specifically interested in like the Islamic or Muslim influence, and also just in general, whether there was historical psilocybin use, or evidence of it within, in the subcontinent, since the Mongols, and just Sufi Islam specifically.
My answer is going to be focused on, the Brahmin traditions and the Buddhist traditions. I can't speak to the other ones. Mm-hmm. I was invited to go to India by an Indian woman who, she had been to Khajuraho and taken a bunch of pictures and went back to Switzerland, took ayahuasca, and one day when she was looking through her pictures, and all of a sudden all these mushrooms were popping out of the pictures. And you might say, oh, well, they were obscure. No, right in the middle of the threshold that you step on to enter the sanctuary. Okay, so where do these traditions come from? Well, I think that there's good reason to think that these are ancient Buddhist traditions. And perhaps even that Buddhism was not a relatively modern religion. It was something that got formalized, 600 BC, but reflected the continuation of the pre-Aryan, pre-Brahmin traditions of the Indus Valley. This friend of mine has been finding all kinds of, stelas and other artifacts from Indus Valley that show mushrooms in them. In fact, there's one that looks like the mushroom is painted red and white. So maybe that was the original soma. But, why is it that people today aren't talking about these things? Well, it's a little difficult. When we started this research project in India, I started inviting scholars, Indian scholars, saying, we'd like to see if you would join us in this project to interpret some of the icons there in Khajuraho. Oh, yes, I'd love to, And then we'd send them pictures and they go, well, what do you think this is? We'll go, well, they look like mushrooms to us. Don't you ever write me again. I never want to hear from you again. Don't ever enter into contact with, just hostile responses. Now, is this because we're offending their religious sensibilities? Or is it because these are hidden traditions that are still being practiced among the elite and the priest? We have an article that should be out in the so-called next issue of the Indian Journal of Traditional Knowledge. And I think it's going to be a blockbuster. It's going to be the most comprehensive statement ever made about mushrooms in India's past. And it includes interviews with village priests done near Khajuraho. We took pictures of 15 different species of psychedelic mushrooms documented in India and showed them to the local priest and the local holy man. And they go, oh yeah, these are the mushrooms of Khajuraho. And they started giving us names for every one and started telling us about their medicinal uses. it's still there in India. You know, how long this will last, I don't know, but there are still entheogenic mushroom practices in India today that are recognized by spiritual religious leaders at the local level. So that's what I can tell you. I can't say anything about the Muslim or the Sufi or any other ones, but I think it's the Buddhist Jain tradition.
We have two questions. One on, where is the question again? Cybers Milga, can you ask it? It's your question. It's a question on Stanislav Grof. Are you and him good friends?
Well, you know, I had the good fortune that Stan contributed a paper to a book I edited once, and I briefly met him at a conference in Switzerland. But, you know, no, I don't have any other contact or friendship with what is probably the greatest icon of psychedelic therapy.
And a question which I think we all know the answer to, but maybe not. What do you think of microdosing?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say we don't do it enough. But in my personal experience, you know, I mean, the idea of microdosing is that the effect is imperceptible. And, you know, even some studies suggest that if you effectively microdose, there's no difference between your microdose and controlled conditions. And so there's a question. You know, in the early traditions of psychedelic therapy, there was what were called psycholytic doses that were, you know, 100 or 200 micrograms instead of 400 or 500 micrograms that would give you a full-blown psychedelic experience. There may also be something between psycholytic and microdoses. You know, so it is a perceptible effect. You know, sometimes when I do this, you know, and I have trouble, you know, sort of measuring a dose because I don't know how much is in the mushroom. Most of the time, I just take a half a spoonful of the ground up stuff anyway and put it in a glass. But to me, it's like when the shit-eating grin kicks in, you go, okay, the psilocybin effect has arrived. So it's not a microdose. So from my point of view, I think maybe something a little more than a microdose ought to be considered an important exploratory area where you can go through the day, you feel happy, you feel good, you're not hallucinating, you know, you're not laying down, you can do all the things you normally do, but your mood and affect is pushed into this, you know, happy space.
Good. You can make a lot of people happy that way, I think. So I have a question or two I'm dying to ask you. One, just if psilocybin benefited humankind so much, and it was discovered early in our history, how come it didn't become normalized and dispersed as because of inclusive fitness? If it benefited human beings, it should have been part of every culture, but not just for shamans, but for human beings, for everyone. So how come it didn't become a kind of a general acceptable part of every culture's
well, I'll start off with an aphorism. The last thing that the bishop of the church wants to hear is that there's a new saint in the parish.
Mm-hmm. But it came before religious, before.
Right,
Catholic
but what I'm saying, once we shifted from shamanic cultures to priestly cultures, then there's a real restriction on access to psychotropics. I mean, Jerry Brown presents evidence, for instance, that psilocybin and amanita mushroom use is well documented in the Christian past, but it appears to have been restricted to you know, the cults, the monks, the monasteries, maybe the priest. You know, once you have a top-down control of consciousness in society, you don't want to have all these new, you know, sources of spiritual inspiration emerging because they're likely to contradict the official narrative. So, you know, so my way of thinking is that once we have priestly organizations dominating society, and particularly given that priestly organizations tend to prefer alcohol-induced alterations of consciousness, we see this big shift in the overall social consciousness. Terence McKenna, I believe, wrote about, the alcohol-based dominator cultures. And once you have those kind of cultures, psilocybin is antithetical to that kind of thinking. I mean, the reason that the CIA quit doing experiments with psychedelics is that the people that they gave psychedelics to started saying, screw this stuff. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going AWOL. I'm dropping out of the CIA. It's like it shifted consciousness in a way that I think is what we hope psychedelics may ultimately be able to do for humanity. So that's why they were repressed and excluded.
Good answer. Well, we all thank you for this remarkable talk, and your energy level is amazing. And I think I'm deeply impressed by how you can keep going for so long and still remain so energetic.
Well, not having to have a daytime job helps.
So thank you very much for this wonderful talk, and I hope we stay in touch. And
well, I'm just going to give a plug for my next talk at Vilnius. There's a conference in June that I've submitted an abstract for, but it'll be on my model of religion, not on psychedelics.
Sounds great to us.